Right. All ready? Well, hello and welcome everybody. It's time for Rowing Chat again, and in our new format as a hangout on air, you can now actually see me looking hopefully bright and breezy, despite the fact that for me it's very early in the morning. Rowing Chat is the podcast with and for people who enjoy the sport of rowing. I'm Rebecca Carrow, and today I'm joined by Rosie Mayglothling. Rosie, welcome to Rowing Chat.
Oh, thank you very much, Rebecca.
Please tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and what you do.
Okay, so I currently, my title is Technical and Coaching Coordinator for British Rowing. I've been doing that since 2015, and my role has changed considerably over that time. So when I started in 2015, a large part of my role was coaching and coach education and a little bit of sports science. And then as the team has become more successful, I now manage a group of sports scientists and some research on behalf of the GB rowing team. So I still have the technical lead for coaching and coach education, but most of my job is now spent with the GB rowing team managing sports science and research.
Fascinating. What a big change, because you've been with the team for a very long time. You must have seen so many differences since from day one to today.
Well, this is actually the third time I've worked for the Rowing Association, but the first time there was probably only 10 professional coaches in the country, and that was in the 80s, mid to late 80s. This time the big change has been that since 2000, the team was reasonably successful in 2000, and during that period leading up to London, each Olympics we've become more successful, we've had a bigger team, and we've won more medals. And in order to do that, you can't stand still. You need to keep moving forward with sports science. As part of that, not just the sports science, but that's the area that I'm particularly keen on, and also in terms of developing the coaches that can coach those crews that can win medals. So that's really how my job's evolved over the last 15 years.
Fantastic. So you are very much focused on the elite coaches who are coaching the national team rather than club coaches, is that right?
Well, I have the responsibility for the technical lead, so it means that although I work probably more with high performance coaches, I still do have a role with our club coaches as well. So we have what's called a technical panel, and the technical panel is made up of club coaches and international club development coaches, and also people at the top end of the sport, so people like Paul Thompson, and that's where we make decisions about what our coach education programme should be.
Fantastic.
So I still have responsibility for that. If it's not to your liking, it's possibly my fault.
Now that's a rash statement. So what's the most challenging part of your job as it is today?
I think the most challenging is probably fitting it all into 24 hours or however many hours there are. It's a very exciting dynamic. I work with a lot of brilliant young people, and so and encouraging them to be to expand upon their ideas, encouraging them to think in a lateral way about what they're doing is something that I really enjoy, but then we have to sort of manage that into something that's going to be concrete and can actually deliver on for the team. So I think that probably it's just it's exciting and we get lots of ideas, but we need to turn them into practice. So it's probably containing ourselves a bit and making sure that we deliver some practice for people on the ground.
So you're not short of ideas, which is great, because I think I'd worry if you were.
Yeah, no, definitely not short of ideas.
Now, you and I first met a good 10 to 12 years ago when you were articulating and codifying British rowing technique as an entity. And
yeah.
At that time, it was a fantastic roadshow of description and fabulous photographs illustrating particularly sculling technique, but also touching on sweep technique.
Yeah.
Since that time, do you feel that that has actually become standardised in teaching terms across the Great British rowing scene?
I think it's more standardised now than it ever has been. But it's very difficult because, especially at the top end, people might have individual variations which are going to be quite small.
Mm-hmm.
So when you look at British rowing technique, I would suspect that if I sit down and talk with most coaches at the top of our sport, we will agree on 98% of what British rowing technique is. But there may be some subtle differences, and the subtle differences may be more around how they describe part of the technique rather than what the technical differences are. So you might have somebody that will perhaps, one of the things that I see a lot of crews doing at the moment is stopping at the finish.
Yeah.
Now, and I think that people don't always understand why they're stopping at the finish, what it means and how it should work. And personally, I wouldn't encourage anybody to stop at the finish. But if you might be trying to get your crew together at a point in the stroke, you might be trying to get them to get the boat to accelerate a little bit more on the way forward, so you want to go a little bit quicker up the slide. But they are minor differences, and actually the theory of what we're trying to do is the same. But I think sometimes people can see the top crews doing something and they mimic it without understanding it. And so certainly what we have written down as British rowing technique has been developed with Paul Thompson, Jürgen Grobler, Darren Whiter. They're all in agreement that that is British rowing technique. They were the people who actually suggested the people for the posters.
Yes.
They're the people that have agreed the wording that we have there as well. So it isn't my ideas, it's ours in British rowing, and it's really what we'd like to see everybody rowing to.
Your slides on applying British rowing technique, which was the original talk that I heard you do, are still one of the most popular downloads from the Row Perfect web shop ever.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, good.
There's a lot of people still searching for it, finding it, and learning from it. So it's still very much in circulation. So, having described this amalgam of senior coaches and how you have codified it, would you categorise your style of rowing as being of a certain type?
What I see internationally is that techniques probably coming closer together because we have more biomechanists now in the sport than ever. And whilst there'll be slight individual variations from one nation to another, the principles are the same of what we're trying to do. So we are in Britain, we describe our style of rowing as a long, leg-driven stroke. And so what we're really trying to do is we're trying to make sure that the blade goes in where the rower reaches to, and the decision about how long that's going to be is up to the coach and varies with whether it's sweep or sculling, and also whether they're lightweight or open weight. But then once the blade is in the water, we're trying to load it up quickly and then start the drive with the legs so the bodies stay in the same position, then open the body as we come into the stroke and finish the stroke with the arms, body and legs all pressing down to keep the weight on the handle. And those are really the key elements of it. And then obviously we have the recovery, which is very important because we know that you can lose a lot of boat speed if you don't recover effectively. So we talk about hands body slide, but actually that's what we do want. We don't want it to be stiff hands body slide. We want it to meld one bit into the next, but we want that fluency on the way forward, and we need the crew to move together in sympathy with the boat. And I think those are the key elements of what we're trying to get over. And hopefully the new pictures and the new posters that we've put out get that over in the same way as the Tracy Langland's ones did before. And
Yes.
Rick Dunn, I think, was the rower before.
That's right.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of discussion, particularly stimulated by Peter Mallory's book, The History of Rowing, about the power phase, the drive, and there being two principal variations. One is sequential, i.e. legs, back, arms, and the other simultaneous, which is legs and back together, and then arms. Which one is more aligned with what you're teaching?
It would be the legs and body, and then arms, because what happens when you, if you do an exercise called sequencing, which I'm sure a lot of people do, so you start from front stops and you just do the first 6 inches of the slide, and you don't use the body at all, and you don't use the arms at all, and then you gradually come out to a quarter slide, quarter from front stops,
yeah,
then half from front stops, and so on. There'll be a point at which you'll find the legs will go down fairly easily, so you don't feel you've got the same resistance on the blade, and that's the point that I'd say to people, you need to therefore bring in your body opening. So the first half of the slide will definitely just be legs, but the body will come in the second half of the drive phase. And it will be at that point at which you need to keep the pressure on the handle, and then you bring the arms in before the body is finished, but it will be quite close to being finished. But you then bring the arms in so that you've got that, again, that fluency. You're trying to make sure you keep the handle loaded all the way through to the finish. And
now,
the danger, we would think, if you do legs and then body and then arms, is that you don't have that fluency between the 3 segments of the stroke, and you don't keep the handle loaded.
Now, you explain that particular drill really clearly in your book as being a very important one to learn. Is that something that you think many coaches use when teaching and coaching their crews?
I see it reasonably often, but I don't think it's used probably as much. I still see lots of people going off from backstops,
yeah,
and I think the danger for me of going off from backstops, that whilst it's a nice stable position and you bring people together, it immediately starts you bending your arms. Then you bring the body in, you open the body, and really what we want to do is move the weight horizontally in the boat, not lift up. So that's why I quite like the sequencing exercise, because it takes you from front stops, it brings the body in, brings the arms in, and you are most definitely driving with the legs, not using the body. And I think the danger is, especially if you have inexperienced people, they will tend to want to lift with the body anyway. So I probably don't see as many people as I'd like to doing that exercise.
That's great. Now, we've got a question here from Elizabeth Kowalka from Rochester in New York. She's at a club called Pittsford Crew, and she asks, how do you coach the recovery with a focus both on floating towards and details for learning how to control the slide?
Okay, so there's lots of things that you can do to help you with the float forward. I think the first thing is that a lot of people tend to think they're trying to get to front stops, whereas actually you perhaps need to think a bit more about the boat coming under you rather than you rushing to front stops. So I think if you can get that feeling of the feet coming towards you in a sort of smooth way, it's a different way of thinking about getting to front stops. So I think that's the first thing that I would say. I quite like to have a bit of fun in the boat, because I think if you don't have fun, why are we out there rowing? So I might get the crew to sing something on the way forward, so that they have some sort of rhythm, or even hum on the way forward, so that they've got something that gives them that idea of floating, taking their time, rather than they are working to get to front spot. So I think there's quite a lot of exercises that you can do, but but the first thing is probably having the idea in your mind that you are not trying to get to front spots quickly.
Yep.
You're actually trying to let the boat float under you. So that idea of the feet coming to you.
I love your idea of humming. It reminds me of a coxswain that I once had who was very Scottish, and he used to sing, "Row, row, row your boat swiftly down the Clyde. Merrily, 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 do not rush the slide." I think we could definitely institute that.
Did it help you?
So I hope, Elizabeth, that gives you a good answer to the focus on the recovery, and I particularly enjoyed hearing your contrast between the desire to get to the catch and an understanding that the catch will come to you if you let the boat do its work.
But can I just say, Rebecca, I know there's other questions as well, but one thing is really crucial is that you need to prepare for the catch very early on in recovery. And you need to make sure that you're in a position to load when you get to the catch. And what I see a lot of people doing is coming forward not in a good place to load with the lower back. So I'm not saying sit up, bolt upright or anything like that. Yes, we want to have rotation rounds and we want the outside hand extended in sweep or out to the side in sculling. But they need to have, they need to be able to load when they get there. So the idea for me would be getting the body over and then getting that feeling of the feet coming up to you so that when you get to the catch, you can immediately put the blade in. So it's that idea of, I know we talk about it a lot, that you put the blade in on the last bit forward. But the problem is if you think about putting the blade in on the first bit backwards, it's too late. You're already part way down the slide.
Understood. That's a great clarification. So let's go on and talk a little bit about the book. You've written this brand new book, and who did you write it for? Who's the audience? Because it's called Rowing and Sculling, Skills, Training, Technique.
Yeah. So the people I was really aiming it for are athletes in clubs who may want to take a little bit more control of what they're doing, or perhaps they don't have a coach themselves, and also coaches that would like some other ideas about what they need to be doing. So it was really aimed, it's not aimed at the very top end of the market. It's really, when I say the top end of the market, I mean people that are already coaching at high performance level.
No.
But I hope that there's something in there for most club coaches to a fairly high level. And I feel particularly passionate about, I think so many people don't plan their sessions very well or plan their annual cycle very well. So for me, it's like baking a cake. So you have all the ingredients and you know what cake you want to make. It's a Henley win or it's a, head of the schools or whatever else it happens to be. So what you need to be able to do is know how many of these ingredients and how many of those ingredients and how long you need to bake it for and which phases it needs to go through. And I hope that within the book I've given people enough guidance that they could then start to write their own programs. And that bit for me is probably, it's a bit of a dark art, I think, that rigging. They're the two dark arts of rowing. And hopefully they're explained well enough in the book so people understand how they will be able to do it themselves. And that's why I say it's aimed, I think, at the club rower who perhaps doesn't have a coach or wants to know more, or the coach who perhaps needs some different ideas and maybe just some additional information or different ideas about how to do things. Maybe what they're already doing, but just a different way of explaining it or seeing it, something like that.
That's really, really great because, interestingly, Row Perfect UK's website is entirely aimed at the same audience. There's a very clear point in a lot of people's athletic career where they start to really enjoy rowing and suddenly have a desire to learn lots and they go to seek. And as you and I know, there's an awful lot of videos on YouTube of extremely poor rowing, which are not great examples to learn from. And so having a place like your book where we can send people to go and acquire a really good broad spread of knowledge in a lot of different areas, and I suspect that people wouldn't necessarily read it from the first page to the last, but it's a book to dip into. When you need that rigging advice, go into the rigging chapter. Is that what you intended?
Yes, and also the rigging, the technique, and the biomechanics should all be very interlinked, because the technique is because you want to move the boat in a certain way. You need to understand what the biomechanics are on the boat in order to get the right technique, and you need to set the rigging up in order to maximise that. So there's also links with bits of the book as well to try and make sure that people understand not just here's some rigging, but why are you trying to do this rigging.
That's really great, because rowing is one of those things that you need to experience it. Reading the book is only the first step, as I'm sure we all know. Now, I've got a question here from Matt Evans from Hull University Rowing Club, and Matt asks, how do you recommend progression to higher performance for novice athletes?
So I think the first thing has got to be that they need to spend time developing their skills. I think the difficulty is if they don't develop their skills first and learn that. So what I see quite a lot in clubs is that we have people who progress to a certain level and then they're not able to go on to the next stage. And I think sometimes that's because they don't have the skills to do that. So they're very, very fit. They go out and they train very, very hard. But what they can't do is they can't then progress on because they don't have the skill set necessary. So for me, the first thing to do is that they need to learn how to do the skills. And ideally you do that in small boats, in singles, doubles, pairs. But if you haven't got those boats, you can still do them in a four. You can still do slaps, and you can still do raising and lowering the hands. So people understand what they're doing. You can still do standing up in the boat. You can still do changing positions. You can change blades over. All of those type of things will really help people to understand the skill set that they need. And then you need to continue to develop those. They shouldn't stand still. You should be able to do them in finer and finer boats and to a higher and higher level. So that's the first thing. And you need to have fun with it as well. People need to enjoy it and not see it as a chore. And then, when they are starting to move the boat, they need to have good technique. And the coach needs to make sure, not for someone just trying it, their technique is going to be incredibly random. So we have to be careful we don't overcoach in that first stage. They need to get the feel of what it's like. But then, once they start to come down a bit more often and they start to develop their technique, you need to really make sure that they are coached in the right way so that they don't develop bad habits. Because we all know that when you've got a golf swing that's really dodgy, it's very difficult to correct it, and the rowing's no different from that.
So from Matt's point of view, taking your novice coach and then wanting to advance their skills in the same way that you've just described for a novice athlete, what should the coaches be doing in parallel?
The coaches need to be curious, and they need to be seeking other ways of explaining things, and they need to. So yes, you need to understand your own sport, and you need to develop your own style, and you need to be clear about what technique, etc., you want to coach. But if you really want to go to high performance, you need to be a very curious person, and you need to become an expert learner. And an expert learner is someone who's solution focused. So I would say the big thing for me is that we have coaching awards. I think they're quite important stepping stones because they mark or give a demarcation of where people are. But around that, people need to be doing their own research, their own exploration, their own reading about things. and being always curious about, well, why are we doing this? Not just accepting that that's the way you do it. And that for me is the way that you become the type of coach that can go to high performance. I would say that if you haven't already, having some sort of mentor is a good idea, somebody that perhaps has a bit more experience than you, so that you've got someone that you can go and talk to about what you're trying to develop and how you're trying to develop it. Don't be scared to get somebody, including your athletes, to comment on what works well and what doesn't work well, because that way you'll become a more effective coach much more quickly, because you won't be wasting your time and their time telling them something that they don't understand what you're talking about. So encourage that feedback, ask for feedback from people, get people to come out with you and watch what you're doing. And I think the final thing is that everybody can add value to the athletes they coach. So if you want to go on the high performance route, you need to be clear about how you've made the difference to those athletes, and then you need to go on from there in terms of producing people that can get to a higher level. So you need to take your time, make your mistakes, don't feel that you need to be coaching high performance athletes from the beginning, but you gradually can move yourself up, and it may be that you're in a fortunate position where the athletes are able to move on because they're very talented and you can move on with them. Yeah. But if they're not, then you might need to move to somewhere else.
Understood. So how can a club structure, a committee that runs a rowing club, help a coach do this? Because in my experience, clubs tend to be more focused on managing their plant, equipment and recruiting than on developing their coaches.
Yeah, we have some very good clubs, that do develop coaches. And I think it's about the club probably recognising that whilst managing everything else is highly important, because clearly if you don't pay the bills, you don't have a rowing club,
yes.
That we're in the people business. And that's both in terms of athletes that come to your club, but also the coaches that you have. And if the coaches give a quality experience, the athletes will come back. And they'll stay in your sport and they'll progress in your sport as well. So I think having a coaching plan within a club is a really good way of engaging your coaches. Possibly having a lead coach who occasionally gets the coaches together, having something where you all agree on a common technique, maybe even agree on some coaching plans and things like that is a very good idea. And that should allow the coach still to be entrepreneurial and to develop their own way of delivering it, but actually having a common theme within the club. And the club will hold on to their coaches if they develop them. So it's in the interest of the club. If someone feels they're not being developed or not being backed by the club, they're not going to stay there for very long. So I think there's benefits all round in terms of the clubs investing in their coaches and probably putting together some sort of plan.
That's a fabulous answer. Thank you very much, and I wholeheartedly endorse what you've just described. We're going to take a short break now to mention our sponsor. The RowingChat podcast this week is sponsored by Rowing Gloves, the only glove designed for boat rowing to protect your hands where blisters develop. Made to a snug fit, each glove has cropped fingers and elasticated joints, allowing free movement and dexterity. There are two designs, one with a textured palm and one with a smooth palm. We recommend a textured glove for the hand that feathers the blade. And so for sculling, you need 2 textured gloves, and for sweep, only 1. Available in 6 sizes, from extra small to double extra large, there is a glove that will fit you. Users report fantastic results for blister prevention and great comfort. They are fiddly to put on at first because a skin-tight fit is necessary. Priced at £15.25 each, these gloves will be your new best friend if you suffer from rowing blisters. You can buy rowing gloves from the Row Perfect shop, rowperfect.co.uk/shop. Now, back to our guest this week, who's Rosie Mayglothling, from the Technical Director for British Rowing. Rosie, we've got a couple of questions from listeners, and Michelle Souza has written in asking, what are your tips for the release and how do you square up the blade without losing balance?
An interesting question, because there is a fine balance between hanging on to the finish and releasing it at the right time. So if we are, I think the big thing is that I've already talked about the drive and the legs and the body opening and then the arms finishing the stroke. And we want to try and maintain the pressure on the handle and a lightness on the seat, so you're not sitting with all your weight on the seat around the finish of the stroke. And then at the point at which your blade comes into your body, then you should just push it down and get it out of the water. If that makes sense. Your body should stay in a strong position until the blade is out of the water. I think that's the first thing in terms of the release of it. But then you asked about the balance and squaring. If you're in a fine boat, I would say this takes you back to the skill exercises as well. And probably getting the crew to sit in the boat, so say you're in a coxed four or something like that, then if you get the crew to sit in the easy oar position, you can do some just pushing the hands up and down, and then you can see if the crew can push their hands down together and balance the boat, and they should have their weight evenly on both feet, evenly on the seat. They should be controlling the height of the blade with the outside hand. So not with the inside hand, but with the outside hand. And in that position, with the hands at the easy oar position, it should be relatively easy to balance the boat. But don't worry if it doesn't come easily initially. You just need to keep coming back to it. So don't try and do 100 of them and they're all failing. That's terrible. But try and do 5, and you will find that if you go away and do something else, come back to it again, it will be better. And gradually the crew will get the idea of how you actually push the hands down at the same time. And then there are other exercises you can do. You can do roll-ups when you're a little bit more confident. So coming from back stops to front stops, put the blade in the water together. So a lot of balance is about the crew moving together. And it's back to that idea I said at the beginning of developing your skills, and you can still do it in a 4 or an 8, whichever boat you happen to be in. But it's about everything needs to be together, and if it's together to the same height, at the same speed forward, then the balance will be there. So you can do some roll-ups, from back stops to front stops to place the blade in. You can also do some pause rowing as well at different points of the stroke. So you just make sure that everybody arrives at the same point together, and they then leave that point together. So there's a whole raft of things that you can do that will help with the balance, because most of the balance issues are about the crew not moving quite as one.
Very
and I was just going to say, generally, it shouldn't be, it's not one person, it's generally several people. Perhaps one person needs to push their hands down a bit lower, somebody else perhaps not so low. So just need to be really working together as a group.
That's a great clarity, and it leads me neatly onto a question that I had. Having read your book, I noticed that you describe a concept in there called the skill continuum. What led you to develop this concept?
I've been very fortunate because over the period of time that I've been rowing, I've been coached by a lot of very good coaches, and I've worked with a lot of very good coaches. And all of them have talked about developing skills. And we know from our world-class start programme, which is now just called Start, that if we develop the skills in those first early stages and get people to be able to operate on their own and develop those skills themselves, that even though they haven't rowed very far up the river, when they do row up the river, they understand what it feels like to put the blade in the water. They understand what the sequencing is like on the recovery and on the dry phase of the stroke. So they're immediately able to be technically more competent. And we also know that when Paul Thompson came to the UK, for example, he challenged our women's squad at the time to do some standing up in the boat, some other skill drills like that, and they were a bit shocked because no one had ever done any of those skills, or if they had, it was, this is what you do in the first 5 sessions, and then we don't ever deliver them again. Well, if you look at our rowers, they're highly skillful. I remember watching an event last year or the year before where it was a short race through a bridge. One of the rowers, who was an international rower, hit the bridge with his blade, lost his blade, put it back and continued on. And that's about skill. Or Peter Haining in the final of the World Championships in the mid-90s, he won 3 or 4 single scull titles. He lost his blade in the last couple of 100 metres, and he'd actually practiced what would happen if he lost his blade, and he managed to get it back again and carry on. So skill is really important at the top end, and our top end rowers are highly skillful. So you should never stop practicing your skills. And that's really the idea, is that right from the beginning, we need skillful players, skillful people. And if we were football players, we wouldn't be just doing skills in the first few weeks and then just running around manically on a football pitch. We'd be developing better and better skills. Getting the ball into the top corner of the net from a free kick is a highly developed skill, which we're not going to be able to do day 1, but we might be able to do year 3.
So,
and rowing's the same.
So when you described the drills earlier, what I noticed was that you had the beginnings of how to strike down your blades to a balance, and then how to progressively add more technical complexity, so that the person who's doing it knows that if they can do the simple one, then there's a more sophisticated version of the skill.
That's right. And also the skill drills, things like the circles, the slaps, it's also about people becoming able to do more of those, because it's about being relaxed enough to do more. Initially, you're going to be a bit tentative and maybe a little bit, you're not going to be as fluid as you will be if you just keep doing them. So it's also about being able to do more of those skill drills if you were to time them for people.
I understand. Now moving on to a question from Maggie Holer from Petaluna. Her club is the North Bay Rowing Club. And Maggie says, in our club, for whatever reason, the coaches seem to think sweep rowing is first and then sculling the poor cousin. I love sculling, she says, for the feedback it gives and the symmetry. Is a preference for sweep common?
Interesting question again, because we have got some nations who tend to go for the sweep boats, and I think it's to do with history. So in North America, both Canada and US, the 8 is probably the most prominent boat. It's probably the one that, or the most prestigious boat, I guess. It's the one that the universities want to win, is in the 8. A lot of the races in the winter are in those big boats in the 8. And so there's a lot of kudos about winning those events, and quite a lot of them have got a long history attached to them as well. Whereas we have other nations who, for them, the best boat is the single. They want to see who's the fastest on their own, or maybe even in a quad sculling boat, who can move the boat the best. So I think there are some nations who tended to move a bit more towards some boats than others, and part of that is history. If you're a development nation, you will tend to be in single sculling boats, because there may not be too many of you rowing, and if you're going to represent your country, there may only be 1 or 2 of you. Certainly in southern Europe, so Italy, Spain, traditionally they've had quite a good connection to the sculling boats. and we've had a lot of good sculling boats coming out of those countries over the years. So I think some of it's around history, and I would say that North America particularly, and probably with them Germany, Great Britain, Holland, all have quite a tradition in sweep rowing and in those big boats. But increasingly we've also developed a love for sculling and also a competence in sculling, because all of our early medals, the GB, 84, 88, they tended to be in the sweep boats rather than in the sculling boats.
Which then leads on to Maggie's second question. She says, does sculling make people better sweep rowers, and if so, how and why?
If you can control a boat on your own, it's back to the skill thing. If you can do it on your own, then you are much more responsive in a bigger boat, because you understand what you need to do to make that boat run smoothly. Also, it's so much nicer to have an 8 where there's 8 scullers in it, because when you say come forward or give an order, they all do it together. Whereas in sometimes in sweep boats there tends to be a bit of a sort of ripple effect down the boat. So stroke will do it, and about 3 seconds later the bow will do it. So I think some of it is about being autonomous, understanding the skill, and yes, it definitely does make you a better rower, sweep rower. And we know in the past we've had sculling boats, so there's been this men's sculling group that have come together from around the world, so Cynic, Campbell, Drysdale, they've all got in an 8 together, and they've gone extremely fast, and yet they are not deemed to be sweep rowers. So we know that scullers can also make sweep boats go faster. The reverse is not necessarily true. So I'm definitely there with the questioner in that, yes, sculling is a beautiful sport, and it definitely improves your technique.
Fantastic summary. And for myself, I was brought up in the generation perhaps that Maggie also reflects, where I was taught to sweep first, and I sorely wished that I had learned to scull first.
Yeah.
Now, Pat Morris from Falmouth Rowing Club asks, what's the most important message to fixed seat rowers in terms of coaching, development and training? Of course, Falmouth, for those who don't know it, is a coastal town in Great Britain, so they'll be rowing on the ocean.
So, we recently had a course where we had some fixed seat rowers, coaches, and we had some sliding seat coaches. And they both learnt from each other, I would say. There is the same principles apply to the fixed seat rowers as apply to the sliding seat rowers, but they still need to develop their skills. They still need to move together. They still need to move in sympathy with the boat. And I think that probably just the very nature of boats and being out on the sea has not always made it so easy for people to practice their skills. But things like roll-ups, things like falls rowing, like, of course, if you're in a big, they row in gigs down in Falmouth mainly, not exclusively, but mainly. They're very big boats, and you take 6 oarsmen in them, and quite wide and stable as well, but they still move around. And the big skill on the sea, for me, is how do you, on a rolling wave, all get your blades into the water at the same time? And so I see huge skill on the sea from people about being able to, in fact, almost do the opposite of what we're talking about on the river, where they can independently find the water so they can still row together. And that only comes from practicing skills on the sea. So I think there's still some really huge crossover between the two, and the best coastal rowers are highly skilled people who also can go out in the most atrocious conditions that on the river we'd be horrified by.
It's interesting. I personally experienced open water sculling, not the same as coastal rowing, because it was in a sliding seat boat. And what I noticed was that I was trying very, very hard to row symmetrically. And I learned quite quickly that that just made me have tense forearms, and that actually the skill of moving with the wave and letting the wave do what it wants to do, because you can't affect it, and then timing, as you correctly said, making your blade go into the water at the correct time, regardless of what's happening with the wave under your boat, is an incredibly refined skill, and I certainly didn't have it.
The couple of times I've been on the coastal boats as well, we had quite, in theory, quite a good crew. In practice, we were extremely poor because we just couldn't get the water together.
I've been trying surf boat rowing.
It's about skill, it's about practicing, and it is still those skills, and it's still being able to pick the boat up around the front end of the stroke and accelerate the boat.
So we've got a very similar question from another listener called Ali Grant, who's in Edinburgh at North Edinburgh Rowing Club. And Ali says, I'd like to ask Rosie to what extent she feels that techniques and drills for sliding seat boats transfers to fixed seat coastal boats. I row a 150 kilogram St Ailes skiff, and I'm always looking for new ideas for training activities. Have you got some suggestions for Ali?
Yeah, I do think that the same types of activities can be transferred, and some of the boats that we have, traditional work boats, things like the St Ailes skiff, I know that's not, it's not such an old boat, but the boats move beautifully, and they run, and they give you a sense of moving over the water. They're not, because they're big and heavy. Once you've got them up and running, you've got a lot of momentum with the boat and the weight of the boat and the weight of the crew. So you can still do the same sort of exercises, and it's exactly the same thing. We're trying to get, we know, as I said before, quite early on the technical point, that once a crew becomes reasonably competent, they can lose an awful lot of speed on the recovery by not moving together. And that would be exactly the same in the bigger boats. If they're not moving together on the way forward, then they're not going to be going in together. And just very minor timing differences will mean that you will not be going so fast. So I think that the skill drills and the skills and the exercises all can still be used. So pause rowing, slapping the blade on the water at the catch, some sequencing, even though it's maybe not with it's not with a sliding seat. All of those things can still be done on the sea. You obviously probably have to pick your moment for some of them, though.
Now, one of the things that I learned rather late on in my own coaching is that when you're doing drills and exercises, the crew can acquire the basic technique of the exercise, but it's only when you put them under pressure that they really begin to see whether or not they have embedded that into their automatic rowing. And so do you advocate doing the exercises at light pressure and then building the pressures or building the rates in order to make it more challenging?
The other thing I would say is there's a danger of doing exercises for the sake of doing exercises. So you need to think, why are we doing this exercise? So if you want to do an exercise to improve the speed of the catch, for example, then you need to think, okay, which exercises are going to improve the speed of the catch? And it could be doing some roll-ups. It might be doing some roll-ups slowly. It might be doing some roll-ups at rate 40, which is quite an art in itself. So it's, first of all, you need to pick an exercise that's appropriate to the thing that you want to develop. And then the next thing is, how do you get the rower to think about taking that into the rowing stroke or the racing stroke? So initially, if you want to change something, yes, you need to do it at low pressure and at low rate, but eventually you need to be taking it into high pressure, high rate, and quite often you'll find that 26, 28, often people can do things up till that rating, and then they go out the window when they come beyond that, because they're suddenly feeling under much more duress physically. So physiologically it's much more challenging. So you do need to make sure you give people sufficient time to embed those changes, but also take them gradually up through the rating, not just sort of suddenly go, right, well, you've got it at 18, now we're going to rate at 40. Right. So yes, you do need to take it through that sequence.
Now, one of the other concepts which you introduced in your book, which I feel is worth mentioning at this point, is the unconscious versus conscious, and competence versus lack of competence square. Could you explain that to the listeners?
Okay. So when somebody's first learning a skill, they are unconscious about what they do. So they don't have any competence either. And what you gradually need to do is you need to change that into a circle or into a square, where they move from being unconscious about what they're doing to be conscious about what they're doing. So they may not still be highly skilled, but they now understand what it is they're trying to do, and they understand. They might not be quite getting it, but they're getting better at what they're doing. They understand that they're not getting it right as often as perhaps they might like to. The next stage after that is that they can produce it. They can produce it on a regular basis, but maybe not at high rating, or maybe not when they've got a crosswind, or it's very wavy, or whatever else it happens to be. So eventually you become the unconscious competent. So you can automatically adjust to anything that's thrown at you, and that's when you become extremely skillful. So I think it's important for the coach to understand where on that spectrum their rower is in terms of the skill they're trying to develop. Because that will also help you to give the sort of feedback that the rower might need. So once they become conscious that they're not doing it properly, then you can actually say to them, okay, here's some ideas about what you might do. Whilst they're still in that first phase of not knowing what they're doing wrong, and it's all a bit of a blur to them, then actually you need to probably give them very small pointers and not try and give them too much instruction, because it will just be wasted, and you will confuse the learner. You need the learner to have time and headspace to think about what they're doing. So that's really what that square's about.
Thank you, that's really clear. Now we're coming toward the end of our time together. Would any of the listeners like to ask questions? If you do, on the right-hand side panel is a group chat. It's triggered through the left-hand side. There's a little blue square that you hover your mouse over. It says chat. Please pop your questions in there, and we'll ask them of Rosie. In the meantime, Rosie, you mention at one point in the book fixing straws to the side of the boat. Can you explain the benefits of this and why someone would want straws on their boat?
Yes, I can. So it's an external marker or clear marker for the rower. So if, for example, you've decided you want to row a certain style, a certain length stroke, and you perhaps have people that are not, maybe when they're racing they get very short, or perhaps they're even youngsters, they might even be over long, they might be getting over compressed in the boat. What you can then do is you put straws on the boat at the angle at which you want the rower to come to, and there's some very clear guidance in the book with some tables of how you actually set that up. So you put a line down the middle of the boat, and then just you measure the distance from the swivel across that line, and then where it crosses the side of the boat, you can actually just put your straw in there, either at the finish of the stroke or the catch. Generally, people tend to put them on the catch. and that way you can make sure that you get the crew to the same length. So it's really why you would use them. So perhaps the crew's either over long or not long enough.
Yep.
Perhaps you've got people that are not the right length. So it's really that's why you would use them.
Now we've got a question from Madeline Scott. She says, as the shortest in my crew, how do I finish my stroke at the same time as the rest of them?
Okay. So there are some things that you can do. Just because you're the shortest may not mean you're the shortest in the water. For quite often, people who are a little bit shorter are conscious of it, so they might use a little bit more body swing, for example. The other thing that you can do if you're really struggling to get to the same length, if you're in a modern boat with modern blades, these days it's very much easier to adjust the inboard. And what you can then do is you can actually slightly reduce your inboard. So leave the pin in the same position, leave the outboard the same as everybody else's, but maybe by a centimetre reduce your inboard. It then means you can move your feet a little bit further away from you to still get the same finish position where you feel you can hang the weight on the handle at the finish. And if you're sweep rowing or sculling, you can then find that you've got a little bit more of an arc inside the boat, which gets you the same length as everybody else. So with modern blades, we have many more opportunities to adjust the rigging very slightly if you really don't feel, and the coach doesn't feel, or somebody externally looking doesn't feel getting to the same point. But probably if you look at somebody like Imogen Walsh, who this weekend won the women's lightweight single, she's not the tallest of lightweights, so she uses a little bit more body swing, but she's highly effective in the boat. So that's again how some people will actually get to the length they need. And even in our men's eights and women's boats at the level, we do not have the rowers all at the same height. So people do manage it by using parts of their body in a slightly different way, probably a little bit more body swing.
I would add you need to be more flexible than anyone else, Madeline, as well. Make sure your flexibility is not compromised at all. Now,
Yeah, absolutely.
Charles Adams from Nottingham is asking, how's British sweep oar rowing changed, the technique changed in the last 20 years? Is it any better biomechanically?
I think we understand the biomechanics better, and I think so in the last 20 years, well, 25 years now actually, we've had big blades. That changed, when the big blades came in, that changed the way that we rowed anyway. It made it easier to get the feeling of loading on the catch, but also, if you hit the catch too hard, you wouldn't be able to continue with the stroke all the way through. So I think the big blades have changed the technique slightly. I think we understand much better now that you need to be loading the blade in front of the 90 degrees. And we understand that better than we did before. We understand the sort of angles that we want people to go out to for sweep rowing. And I think as well, if you look at our heavyweight men now, that whereas they might have been extremely fit and strong and maybe not technically quite so competent, now the sport at the top end is so competitive that people have technically, whether they're open weight or lightweight, they've all had to improve their technique. So I would say that all of our rowers are much more technically competent, and we do understand the biomechanics much better than we did.
Very interesting. So all of the advice that you've been giving for club coaches, for novices, for people who want to advance their own skills will serve them in extremely good stead, because if you have the capability of getting all the way to the top, you're certainly going to need your skills, if I understand you correctly.
You definitely will. You cannot be rowing in a boat and not be competent and aware of what the boat's doing. You absolutely have to be aware of what's going on in the boat, and also the smaller you are. So, if you happen to be
Madeline.
the world's biggest person, Matt, I'm not saying he was technically, but someone like Matt was incredibly strong.
Yep.
Whereas somebody like Tim Foster or James Cracknell had to be technically extremely competent in order to match Matthew Kingston.
There was a delightful aside, if you follow James Cracknell on Twitter recently, where he said, in response to Gary Herbert, "Gary, you didn't row with me, you coxed me." Now, Hannah has come up with a question. She says, when you're teaching beginners, do you think there's value in using Mac-on blades to teach the pick-up at the catch and then progressing to big blades as they become more competent?
I think there's two advantages to using Mac-ons. The first is that you don't get that feeling of loading on the catch, so you have to be more precise with what you're doing. And I also feel that for youngsters, where they possibly, for anybody who comes into the sport for the first time, they may not have the right core that they need. As I said before, you need to be ready to load at the front end of the stroke. If you go for big blades, you'll certainly get the feeling of loading. But if you haven't got the core, then you could end up getting injured, or you just won't be able to maintain that pressure. So actually, it's counterproductive. So absolutely, I'd agree with Hannah that learning with Mac-on blades for anybody is a good thing. And we probably are quite quick to get out our best equipment, and probably we should be coaching a little bit more with some of the Mac-on blades. Yeah, definitely.
Right, so that's the end of the questions that we've had for Rosie Mayglothling. Rosie, it's been an absolute delight. Thank you for your generosity, sharing your wealth of experience. And please, can you let the listeners know where they can connect with you if they want to pick up with you after the event?
Yes, they can send me an email, I guess, to rosie.mayglothling@gbrowingteam.org.uk. So that's probably the best way of getting hold of me.
Fantastic. Now, our free prize draw winner this month gets a copy of Rosie's book, Rowing and Sculling, Skills, Training, Technique. In order to be in to win this, you need to be on the Row Perfect UK newsletter list, and it's a free prize draw to anyone who is subscribed. We welcome comments and suggestions for new episodes of Rowing Chat, or if you've got any further questions, you can send them to Rosie or to us, info@rowperfect.co.uk. Past episodes are available at rowperfect.co.uk/rowing chat, and you can follow us on Twitter @rowperfect or on Facebook, Row Perfect UK. Subscribe to the Rowing Chat feed in iTunes, SoundCloud or on YouTube. Just search for Rowing Chat. And if you've enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review and share this with people in your club, which will help other rowers get more enjoyment from rowing and learn from experts like Rosie. For more information about Row Perfect UK and its educational services for coaches, coxswains and athletes, go to rowperfect.co.uk. Thanks everybody very much, and we'll see you in a month's time. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you very much.